Welcome to the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast by Venus O'Hara. I'm here to welcome you into the world of orgasmic living by hosting experts to discuss orgasmic topics such as nutrition, spirituality, personal development, sexuality, and much more. Here, we will offer lifestyle lessons that can help you lead a fulfilling, joyous, and orgasmic lifestyle. I'm your guide, Venus O'Hara. Welcome to episode 92 of the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast with Venus O'Hara. In this first quarter moon episode, we discuss sexual health. We speak with Andy Kogelnik, founder of BasisDx, a company that provides home STI testing kits. I also review the book Red Sky at Midnight by Laurie Lee. And the episode ends with a guided meditation with affirmations for safe sex. But first, let me share with you one of my most personal and embarrassing stories ever that I hardly share with anyone, to be honest. So I hope you appreciate this gesture on my part because I think it's an important message. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let me tell you a story that's very personal and very embarrassing, but I'm sharing it to actually raise awareness about the topic of sexual health. It's very, very, very important. Anyway, let's go back in time to the 2000s. Maybe it was 2000, I don't know, maybe I don't want to give away my age. Anyway, it was a long time ago. And I was seeing a guy, we were living together, we had an explosive sex life with explosive arguments, not always at the same time, but the passion was just, present in all areas of our relationship. And sometimes that was a good thing, sometimes it was a bad thing. Anyway, there was one day we were having sex and then we changed position from missionary to on all fours. And during that change, well, he withdrew and then re-entered. This awful, awful, awful smell filled the room. And it was so bad that we had to stop. And the smell was coming from me. And I was like, what is this? What's going on? I mean, for the most part, we used condoms. So he never came inside me. So for the most part, like 90% of the time we were, practicing safe sex. And there was the odd time when we didn't. But still, there was this incredibly disturbing smell, which was very embarrassing. And it was so bad that we couldn't continue. So we just, I thought I was about to have an epic orgasm. I was like, oops. It was a mood killer. I mean, the mood killer is an understatement. So after that, I decided it was time to go and book an appointment with a gynecologist. And it was here in Spain in August. I went to the gynecologist. I got examined, but it turns out that the gynecologists were all on holiday because it was August. And that's the thing in Spain. Sometimes a lot of things shut down in August, but to not be able to see an actual doctor was quite worrying. And that's a very worrying part of this narrative that I'm sharing today. So I saw a nurse and she put the speculum inside me, even got the lights out, and then she took a swab and then told me to come back on the 2nd of September. And that's a date I will never forget, 2nd of September. During that summer, I went to the UK, I saw family, and I was with a friend who had a toddler, and he was kind of waist height. And I was thinking, if he comes near me, he's going to know I smell. Oh my God. Because at the time, during that really long wait for these results, I used to shower in the morning and I felt that I had no discharge. I was very dry. And then this really weird smell would just happen between my legs, and it was kind of noticeable. And I was a bit paranoid that people would be able to detect it. So I had this whole month of just worry. And also I actually accused the guy I was seeing and living with, who was my partner, or who I thought I trusted. I accused him of sleeping with other people because how could it be that I've got this strange thing happening inside me? He assured me that no, that wasn't the case. And he told me he was going to get tested for everything. So he went along to the local STI clinic and got tested for everything. And also, men are not as used to kind of getting their bits out for doctors as women are, with our, regular gynecologist appointments. I mean, here in Spain, it's like every year as opposed to every 3 years as they do in the UK. But he had to get this swab down his, I don't even know what you call it in English, down his urethra. It's like very invasive. So he went through this very invasive things or appointments just for me, just to prove a point, really, just to reassure me. And all his results were fine. And then so I still felt awful. So we decided not to have sex for that time until I got my results. And that time was just for me very, you're with some person that you trust, you love, and you want to have mind-blowing sex. And then suddenly that's taken away for medical reasons. It was a very tense time for us. And when the 2nd of September came, I was taking the pill at the time. So I knew that night my period was due, because that would be my week break of the pill. So I always knew the time and also sometimes the hour of when the period was come. And so I went along to the doctor expecting to get some awful diagnosis. But more than anything, I just wanted the clarity just to know what the hell is wrong with me. And when I get to the doctor, because it was September, it was actually a real doctor this time. And she said, all clear, you've got nothing. And I was like, no. If I'd listened to that doctor, I would have walked out and been none the wiser. Actually, I would have been more confused than anything. But thank God, I listened to my intuition and I said, there is definitely something wrong with me. So that diagnosis of having nothing, a clear bill of health, was not good enough for me, because I knew in my heart and soul that there was something very wrong with me. Anyway, she was not a very nice person, this woman. She goes, okay, then lie on the bed. I'll examine you. So she examines me. And then she does there was a nurse as well there. And then she did some huffing and puffing. But I just had to kind of get, checked by an actual doctor. And then she says, I'm not surprised you smell. You've got a tampon in here. The tampon had been inside me for a month. This is so crazy. And I think I just put one in without realizing. I thought I'd taken one out and put one in, because sometimes these things are automatic. You don't really think. And people might think it's stupid to put an extra tampon in or to forget to take it out. But it's actually a lot more common than you think. And I felt stupid about it as well. And from that day on, I just stopped wearing tampons, because that I just lost faith in myself, lost trust in myself. But anyway, going back to that doctor's appointment, she took it out and it was rancid. I mean, this thing was just disgusting. And then she put it in the bin. And she said to the nurse, change the bin because it stinks. And I just was lying there with my legs open, feeling so vulnerable. And then I had to have these vaginal antibiotics, which is kind of like putting this yellow tablet inside your vagina, and then it kind of it stings a bit, and then it kind of dissolves, so you get all this kind of yellow mustard like discharge for a few days. And then I called my boyfriend and I told him what was going on. He said, you owe me an apology, which he was so right. I did owe him an apology. But I think the point of that I want to make in this story is that sometimes if you do have something wrong with you and you're in a fluid bonded situation, it's not necessarily the case that your partner's been cheating on you or anything like that. It just, not all, things with the genitals are related to, promiscuity. You can just have something that's not quite right, having a, mismatched pH, or there's just other things that can be going on as well. So it's not always a case of having sex with lots of people. So yeah, that was a massive lesson for me. And the lessons I learned from that is, from that point I started to use, I stopped using tampons. And since then, I remember I did a photo shoot once, and I had to wear lingerie, and I had my period, and it just made sense to actually wear a tampon again. But the paranoia I had of having to use a tampon again years later, I was like double, triple checking I'd taken it out, because I just remembered that I would have died had I not insisted, because I would have had a block. I would have had TSS, the toxic shock syndrome, sepsis, something terrible would have happened. But thank God I listen to my intuition, which is so important. So even if, there's something on paper that says a certain thing, you must always listen to your body and what it's telling you, because everything is a sign at the end of the day. So yeah, that was a massive, massive lesson. And also as a result of that, I started private medical care, because even though the state care, healthcare in Spain is pretty good, the protocols are very different in private healthcare. For example, if this had happened to me in a private setting, I would have had a vaginal ultrasound, so that it would have been visible on a screen straight away that there's something inside blocking me. And also the appointments are much longer, and you don't have to wait as long. So you're getting to see a doctor all the time. It wouldn't have been a nurse, So the protocols are very different. And also when I did need hospitalization for a very different thing, I was able to choose the hospital, get Instagram friendly food, have an ensuite room. So I really do believe that health is worth investing in, and having, regular blood work and regular testing, and just looking after yourself, because prevention is better than cure, as they say. And just that's why I don't really share this story very often, because I just think people gonna think I'm stupid for leaving the tampon in. But I'm sharing it because I think it's important. I think it's important to know that these things happen, and it's really important to know how your body reacts to certain things, and yourself if there's something wrong with you. And if you do feel that there is something wrong with you, I would highly encourage you to seek medical attention until you are satisfied with the answers and the care. So there you have it. So something very intimate about me right now. And I hope you appreciate the opening up, because this is like a mega, mega personal story that I do not tell many people, but I'm doing it with the best of intentions, and hoping that this will help someone somewhere. Are you looking to strengthen your pelvic floor in a fun and engaging way? Introducing PeriFit, the pelvic floor trainer that combines biofeedback with interactive video games. With PeriFit, you can track your progress and improve your pelvic health while playing games with your vagina on your smartphone. It's easy, effective, and more importantly, it's fun. For a limited time, you can get 25% off with the code Venus15 at checkout. Visit perifit.co today and take control of your pelvic health with PeriFit. That's perifit.co. and use the code Venus15 for 25% off. The link is also in the show notes below. Strengthen, play, and thrive with PeriFit. Disclaimer: consult your healthcare provider before starting any new fitness program. Now it's time for this episode's interview. We speak with Andy Kogelnik, founder of BasisDx, a company that provides home STI testing kits. Andy Kogelnik, welcome to the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast. Thank you so much for taking part in this interview today. For those who are unfamiliar with your work, could you tell us what you do?
Sure, it's great to be here. I'm a physician scientist. I've been working around diagnostic testing for way too many years. And the thing that I'm doing most recently is working on home testing for STI conditions, and trying to remove some of the stigma around those and get better access for people to those kinds of tests in their own home.
Mm-hmm. So what inspired you to actually choose this path? Because you're from the medical field anyway.
Yeah, well, STIs have been a sort of a steadily rising epidemic over many, many years now, but particularly in the last few. And particularly after COVID, the numbers have continued to move upward on the scale. So there's sort of an epidemic going on of various of these conditions. And we were sort of looking at post-COVID, what we can do. We'd already been doing some work in that area. And so with all of the home testing and mobile testing that we had done during COVID, this seemed like the right opportunity and a huge need. And we had also been out there with a lot of mobile and sort of access to care issues previously. So it seemed like a perfect coming together of enabling people in their, of enabling people in their own communities to do something positive for their health and stem this sort of larger public health issue.
Okay, so I've heard a lot about home testing before of STIs, but I was wondering, how does it actually work? So you buy a kit online. What's the procedure? What's the process?
Yeah, well, every test is built a little bit differently, but the basic principle for ours and a few others is that you can buy a test online.
Mm.
We send you a box, a kit, and in that kit is a small set of tools, if you will, to take your own sample. You can in some of the cases you can get help online, so it might have a televisit along with it. And then you return that sample via the regular mail or overnight mail, and we run it in the lab on the same instruments that we would run, a sample if you went to get your blood drawn, for example. The good news is many of these samples don't need to be blood anymore. Some of them do. But we have a way of getting finger prick blood into small containers and shipping them back and having them be stable enough during that transit time that we can still get good signals out of them and get the individual information that they wanted. So we report back those results once we run the test online. So it comes straight to your phone or to your email, and you have a very private channel for getting that information.
So just to be specific about, because I'm someone who hates any type of medical intervention. Like I used to hate those. What were they called? PCRs. I was like, oh my God. That was the worst experience of my life. That was worse than the gynecologist. I mean,
yes,
it was terrible. So to be more specific about so you talked about the fingerprint. Would that be like something that someone with diabetes uses or?
Yeah, exactly. It's that type of a lancet and that type of a technique. So you're sticking your finger. Most of the kits have two ways of sampling, and that really depends on what we're testing for. So some of the conditions we test for via blood, and others we can test in the urine or via a swab. And so obviously urine's easy to collect at home. The swab is a little bit more involved, but also most people can handle that pretty well. So the finger stick becomes the most challenging, but as you said, it's there's lots of people at home doing a finger stick for diabetes and so forth, and it's the same type of lancet. It might be a little bit different size and shape, but same type of thing where you're sterilizing an area on your finger. You're putting a tiny little lancet on there and giving it a little stick. And then we have a small tube that you run up against that to collect the blood, and then you apply a small Band-Aid over that, and you're done. So it's no more scheduling an appointment to go in to have blood drawn and so forth. The convenience of doing it at home obviously is a big deal, and we hope it makes things more accessible. We even actually have some doctors' offices using it. As opposed to having to have a phlebotomist there to draw someone's blood and so forth. It just makes for an easier user interface in today's lingo.
Absolutely. And I think I've heard, and then if you can verify this, but for example, testing someone for the vaginal swab, you don't need to put those awful speculums inside and, all of that kind of...
Yeah, that's right. The swabs are a simple, it's basically a cotton type swab, like similar to a Q-tip, but different. But actually, we've done them on Q-tips even. And for women, it's a gentle swab, just inside the vagina. And for males, it's actually a meatal swab. You don't actually have to insert it into anything for the males. There are a few tests where the users are also doing a pharyngeal swab, so an oral back of the throat swab, and a rectal swab. So we actually have a kit that's being used in the adult film industry, and of course they need to check everything, and they have some higher standards than the average person probably might need. But so we offer something that's as simple as the basics, all the way up to sort of a professional grade type of panel, and depending on what you order is what you get the instructions to test.
So when you get the results, do you provide any type of action or what people should do from that point?
Yeah, well, if the results are negative, of course, that's the
Mhm.
best outcome, and you don't have to do anything, and you go on about your merry way. But yes, if the results are positive, we either in some jurisdictions we can provide actual care in terms of prescribing antibiotics and managing treatment. We're working on getting that across all the U.S. states,
Mhm.
but in others, we will just help you get access to a healthcare provider, either through a telemedicine partner or if the person has a local doctor or other provider, we'll make sure that that handshake happens and that they get the result so that they can be treated appropriately.
So going back to I actually looked at on your website, BasisDx, just to see what kind of kits you had. And I've got to confess that I'm a sexual wellness content creator for many years, and there were some things I'd never heard of. It's
In
interesting. Like
in
this,
term in terms of the diseases, or in terms
yeah,
of
there was one that was beginning with M. I can't remember the name of it now. It's like, what is
probably
that?
MGen, Mycoplasma
Yeah, because I
genitalium.
looked it up and I was like, and they said it's the new STI. I was like, what is this? Could you
Yeah,
like to
no,
enlighten us?
it
Hmm.
absolutely. It's one of those that's not really come up until maybe the last 5 to 10 years, but particularly in the last few years, we've seen a huge increase in the numbers for that particular bug. It's not necessarily any more or less aggressive than some of the other bugs, but it's out there and it's in circulation. That's one that actually relatively recently got added to the professional panel. So, if the professionals are testing for it, that tells you something.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, yeah, I mean, I think it probably will come more and more into the conscious stream of discussion in broader social circles as we go on, because it really has had a pretty steep climb in terms of just its recent positivity in the general population. Um,
Hmm.
but all of these are really, it's about a risk question, and sort of how much risk is it any particular person taking, and how can we protect them against that risk, and so this becomes a very personalized question of what do you do and what do you test for, and we do our best to help people sort of navigate that question, but at the end of the day, testing yourself at a certain cadence, say annually, is probably not a bad idea if you're sexually active, at least to cover the bases once, and then you can kind of figure out from there where to go to on a more regular basis. But most of the public health recommendations now sort of do that across the board, particularly around HIV, of course,
Hmm.
but other conditions as well.
So this MG was called. What are the symptoms and what are the implications of it if you have a positive result?
Well, the symptoms are not too different. It's Mycoplasma genitalium, or it's commonly called MGen,
Hmm.
and the symptoms are not really that different from other STIs. I mean, it can be just various types of discomfort in the
Hmm.
genital region. Usually, as the name implies, it's genital.
Hmm.
Um, you don't really get any sort of characteristic lesion or anything like that, like you might with, say, syphilis or a herpes virus. So it's not typically thought to be painful, but it's definitely uncomfortable. And you might have discharge. You might have itching. You might have other signs of discomfort. So it's from a symptoms perspective, it's nothing that's way out there. But the good news is, from a treatment perspective, it's actually quite treatable, and it's a short course of antibiotics typically, and and then obviously rechecking to make sure the infection's cleared in some cases, um, and again balancing sort of risk going forward. I just want to put a plug in talking about positivity, that one thing that many people forget or are there's a stigma around talking about these things with your partner.
Mm.
And one of the most important things across the board, MGen or otherwise, is if one person has positivity, that you're having that discussion with your partners and that they get tested as well and hopefully treated as well, um, if they should be positive. And part of our push is around that. So it's not just what we're doing is not just unique in the lab side in terms of the home testing and those kinds of things, but we've tried to empower the mobile and IT side along with this. So sharing results becomes a simple thing. And part of our goal is to try and help normalize that, right? It's getting people to have a different discussion about their sexual health and their sexual wellness is really critical to maintaining their health. And if we don't have these conversations and we don't have more openness to data and better data in the first place in terms of having a test done as opposed to, oh, I don't want to go to the doctor, I don't want to go get my blood drawn, it's such a pain. Making it easier to do is one step in sort of resolving this epidemic, but also making it more accessible in terms of the data and making those conversations easier to have, both when when and if you should turn positive, but also before you engage with a new partner, and those kinds of things. So part of this to me is, how do we socialize and remove the stigma? And there's a big push coming up in July around Zero Stigma Day for HIV in particular. But part of that is about that issue of how do we get people to talk about these things in a non-blaming way, because they're out there, and unfortunately they're out there in quite high numbers these days.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, it's interesting. So, what's are most things treatable?
Well, that's actually the good news, is that most of the things that we are testing for and public health in general is looking at are treatable these days. The HIV even is now a manageable condition. It's not that we can cure it per se, but it can be managed, and it can be managed quite effectively for decades. Most of the other conditions are treatable, and typically in relatively short courses. The challenge again becomes when people don't treat them and they let them fester, and that's when they really start to take hold in other ways that have longer term consequences. And that's what we want to avoid for everybody, across the board, right? The earlier you treat an infection, the better the result is going to be, no matter what you're doing, almost universally across the board in infectious diseases.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the best way to prevent STIs?
Well, as I said, I think having more open conversations and more active testing, particularly around assessing our own risk, in terms of our behavior and our activities. It's actually quite doable these days, with the technology, with kits like our home kits, but with lots of information out there. The risk reduction is very achievable, and in many cases it doesn't have to cost very much, and in some cases in certain areas it's free. So not taking advantage of those is a shame, but those are really, to me, the key to having a healthy, happy life. Whether you're talking STIs or other illnesses, is get the information that you need if you're at risk for something, and get it taken care of, because the longer you don't, the worse the potential problem is going to be down the road. And that, nobody wants that. I mean, we want to cut things off early, before they become big problems.
It also can prevent you from having a good sex life as well. So maybe
Well, absolutely.
out of action
Absolutely.
for a long time.
Yeah.
What about condoms?
Well, certainly they're part of a preventive strategy, and a very effective one when used properly. But therein lies the rub, right? Is are they used in any given interaction, and B, were they used properly? And that goes for really any type of disease prevention, right? If you have a tool, I'll never forget my one of my intro public health classes in medical school. They gave us this scenario, which was a real world scenario of a sex educator demonstrating to a relatively health uninformed population about condom usage, and they didn't want to fully have the conversation about genitalia and so forth because in that culture it was not very accepted, and so they rolled the condom down on a banana. And you can imagine the funny stories that ensued from that, because some people in the class mistook that as the sort of the way to use the condom properly, was to put it on a banana next to you. And I mean, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's out there, right? And if people don't understand what it is that you're giving them and how to use it fully properly, they won't use it right, and that doesn't really have a good end. But yes, I think condom usage should be on everybody's list in terms of protection, and there are obviously many ways and many attempts to do many things in the public health sphere, and all of them have none of them are 100%, and that is part of the challenge, right? So we all have to be a little bit educated about this to keep ourselves healthy and happy.
Yeah, what scares me is I think the HPV, even condom use, is not going to protect you against that.
Yes. Well, HPV and HSV, so human papillomavirus and herpes simplex, both, are potentially transmitted, around condom use, in the sense of there are other contacts, oral or otherwise, that could transmit them, and that's a risk. But HPV in particular, I think, is a huge challenge right now in the testing arena, because we don't have great tests for it, right? It's a hard one to nail down in a preventive sense of, I'd love to put that in a kit that we can send to someone's home and test, but the technology is just not there yet. And we are launching a HSV1 and 2 product this month, which I think will be great. But that also is, it's more of a, have I been exposed, as opposed to how do I prevent myself from exposure to it, because you're testing antibodies, so you're testing sort of your body's reaction to that. But it's also, again, equally important that you have that data, because there are some things you can do there, and certainly you can always change behaviors to help mitigate risk for others. So that's, knowledge is power, as they say.
So imagine like you've had some kind of sexual encounter that's been risky, maybe a condom broke or something. How long after that time should you test? Because I think some things have an incubation period, or is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the argument for regular testing, right? It is that if you're engaging, depending on what behavior you're engaging in, what activities you're engaging in, you want to be tested on a more regular basis, and not wait for a crisis like a condom breaking or something like that, where something else failed. So most public health agencies generally are going to recommend once a year if you're sexually active. If you're in high risk groups, either from anything that you're doing, or multiple partners and so forth, then typically the recommendation is more frequent, and just taking that to the extreme level, for the adult film professionals that we work with, they're typically tested every 2 weeks.
Wow.
So twice a month, which tells you something, and part of that has to do with filming cycles. So those are perhaps an example of sort of extreme preventive measures, but I think they're actually very appropriate, and I think the average person should take that in perspective and use that as a gauge to to think about their own health and how frequently they need to test. But I think, certainly if you've never had an STI test and you've had sex, it's time to go get one, just to inform yourself at the very least, and preferably maybe you're doing it with your partner. It's actually I think a good way to bond over something that you might not think about bonding over otherwise. But I think you have to really think about, and there's a lot of resources out there for helping people to do this. What is your risk level, right? And how do you protect yourself the best, and sort of what regimen is best for you.
Mm-hmm. So imagine talking about partnerships and relationships. So imagine you have a monogamous, fluid bonded relationship, and imagine you start to have some symptoms. Does that mean you have something that's positive? Does that mean your partner's cheated on you? I mean,
not necessarily, right? I mean, there could be something that one of you had and you weren't aware of. There are some bacteria that we test for that are part of the normal flora. So they're part of the normal bacteria that live in and around on us. And they're normal, quote in quotes, when they're in small quantities, but when they're in large quantities, it becomes an STI and you have symptoms. And that's one of the reasons why we leave some of those on our panels, because oftentimes in a regular STI test, if you didn't have that bug on there, so I'm talking specifically about Gardnerella here, everything else will come back negative, and the person will say, "Oh, well, I feel funny, but my test was normal." And the reality is that yes, you were negative for, the standard fare of STI tests, but actually there is something going on in your body, and here's a clue as to what it is, and that is something that's quite treatable. So if you're having symptoms and you're uncomfortable and your test was negative, well, I would suggest that you look at a broader panel, because there are things like that out there where it didn't have to involve any cheating or anything else on anyone's part, but it could still be out there. And then, of course, there are some conditions where the conversion rate is very slow. So HIV can be one of those, right? You can have been exposed to HIV for years prior to when you actually seroconvert. And that adds to the challenge, of course, of making the right decisions in terms of assessing risk. But that's why I say if you're sexually active and you've never been tested, you should go get tested anywhere, anyhow, and probably on a first pass, relatively broadly, just so you know where you are, and you can protect not only yourself but your partner, should something come up. And the same kinds of things can be said for HSV1 and 2 as well, right? If you are exposed to those, you may not show any actual physical symptoms necessarily. You may, and they might be very painful, and you have a sort of a wake-up call that way. But testing for exposure to them tells you something and tells your partner something, and can inform you both about how you would want to proceed with your relationship and your intimacy. We also have a number of groups that work with us in the polysphere, right? And it's a whole nother question of risk and trust and verification and so on. And those groups take, the ones that we work with anyway, take it very seriously, and they have self-prescribed to themselves rules around how often and when someone needs to be tested with respect to their relationships within a group like that. And so it's also another interesting twist on sort of the question of when and how and what do I get tested. But I think kind of the bottom line rule is test early and test often, because it's one of the best ways you can protect yourself. I mean, obviously, other things like condoms notwithstanding, but having that information really is, I think, the most powerful thing anyone can do in a relationship, and in terms of preventing and protecting themselves.
Mm-hmm. So it's what you talked about before is an epidemic. So do you have any stats on the STI trends or any information that surprised you in this journey?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the main stats and the sort of the main summary of the stats is increase. The last 5 years alone have seen huge increases, and the one that surprised me the most was that during COVID, during lockdown, when we supposedly were not as socially interacting, most, if not all, of these conditions went up.
Wow.
Um, Perhaps and by large numbers. So there was already sort of an epidemic wave hitting us pre-COVID, and it got markedly worse during COVID. So the ones that sort of are on the top of the list, chlamydia and gonorrhea certainly have surged. MGen we already talked about a little bit. Syphilis has been on the rise for quite some time. Kind of surprisingly, HIV has actually it's been a very slow perhaps increase, but it's almost level in terms of not having that, seeing the acceleration that some of the other conditions have seen. But yeah, I mean, the short answer again is that almost everything is going up, and that's really concerning from a public health perspective.
Wow. What about
And from
demographics?
a personal one.
So I've also heard about like senior citizens when they think, oh, we can't make babies anymore, so let's just forget the contraception. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, that's a great question,
Mhm.
and I think the answer might surprise a lot of people. So it's a wonderful, there certainly are disproportional increases in seniors
Mm.
for some of these conditions, and you can imagine part of that is social structure, right? When seniors are increasingly in residential facilities where there's these massive neighborhoods of seniors that people are building and all over the country, really. But people used to think of it as Florida only, but these retirement communities and or assisted living facilities, or and today's seniors are not inactive by any stretch of the means.
Wow. That's cool though, isn't it?
And yeah, no, it's great. I mean, go, good for them, and
Mhm.
go. But the same rules apply, right? You have to understand your risk, and you
Mm.
have to protect yourself, and perhaps even more so because your community, is it's perhaps narrower than you might realize. And just like with COVID or anything else, if we introduce an infection or the common cold, you introduce an infection into a community like that where people are socializing and then some, it's going to spread. And so protecting those communities is really key. Of course, there are other activities and other communities that are affected. Certainly, LGBTQ community has disproportionate rates for certain things, and thankfully, there's a lot of activity around awareness and prevention going on that's driven from that community, and we've been part of that as well, and it's really great to see. But as with any community, I think there's a lot of variance to understanding and attitudes, and really that's a big part of what we're trying to do, and why we love being on podcasts with people like you is just get the message out there that people need to take care of themselves, and wow, here's an easy way to do it, right? Let's get you that support and that help that you need to be preventive and be smart about your health and live a happy, full, and successful life and sexual life and so on. But really, knowledge, I can't say it enough, knowledge is power, and people need to avail themselves of that.
Speaking of knowledge is power, my next question was going to be about sex education. I mean, I went to a Catholic school in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
so there was no education at all about safe sex because it was just assumed that you're going to get married to one man, and then to show your love, the guy puts his penis in his wife's vagina. And I used to think that, if a family had 5 kids, they'd done it 5 times if they had, I just thought,
Right,
I had all
right.
these questions, like you thought, intercourse was a guarantee, so I thought my parents have had it twice because I've got a brother.
Yeah.
So it was just all these questions. I mean, and we had one lesson in at the age of 11 about growing up, and it was more about puberty. But there was
Yeah.
no, and then in the Protestant school down the road, they were putting the condoms on cucumbers, not bananas, but cucumbers. And they had a
Yeah.
lower rate of teenage pregnancies, interestingly. But my school is pretty crazy. So there's this real denial of the importance of this education.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that
Mhm.
is one of the challenges we face because, especially in today, we have all this uh, increased pressure and increased activity, particularly on young folks, and the education hasn't really matched that. I mean, the education for a lot of people today is the internet, and we know how that goes in terms of there's just any information out there, and much of it is very wrong. So having these conversations and educating people about what they need to do for their own health and their own uh, uh, sanity and happiness, really, I think, is key in a way that doesn't stigmatize, and that still in our world today, right? That still is a big challenge because many of these STIs are mostly incorrectly associated with badness in
Mm,
terms of a person, right?
mm,
Yes, they are associated with certain behaviors can drive them, and certain activities can drive them more readily than others. But in today's world, people aren't just having sex twice if they had 2 kids. And just look, even just the simple math of divorce, right? I mean, okay, you had 2 kids, but more than 50% of households now have divorced. So within 5 years, you have a new partner. Well,
mm.
what do you know about the other partner and their sexual history? Probably not a lot. And most people don't have those open conversations, let alone all the other sort of options that have arisen for people's lifestyles in the last 10 years. But I think, the great thing is just that many of these communities are really embracing sort of the change of openness that's been happening and having these conversations right alongside other conversations that are important to them. So I think that really helps to take the stigma out of a lot of the conversation.
Yeah, because I'm from I grew up with a very Catholic mentality, and it's always about, if these things arise, it's because of promiscuity, and so people are
Yeah,
assuming that only sin is this is like a punishment of your
right.
sinful life. Yeah.
But that's not true. I mean, that is there are, sure, there are activities, as I said, that are associated with higher risk, but
Mm,
there's so many activities that we don't see in a partner
mm,
on a day-to-day basis that we have to have a level of trust if we're going to be intimate with somebody. Um, and without those conversations, it's 100% trust, and without testing, it's 100% trust. And that may work in some relationships, but it doesn't work in all.
mm.
And as we've seen, on a public health level, the rates are going up.
Mm.
So something's not working.
Yeah.
And the only way to really address that fully is to have broad open conversations about this stuff and get testing in people's hands and enable them to use that.
Mm. How many
Um,
different types of tests do you have?
right now, I think we have 6 different tests. There's another 2 coming out this month, and probably another one in the fall. And some of that is just different configurations aimed at different groups in terms of how people want to use this. In terms of the number of things that we can test for, I think we're up to about 15 now across all of the panels that we have.
Mm.
which is exciting. There's definitely some limits to what you can do at home, but
Mm.
we feel like we're sort of edging that barrier ever upwards. Um, and hopefully, we're going to be doing some non-STI stuff as well. That's just general health related, men's health, women's health, and hopefully we can continue to sort of make that type of information more and more accessible. I've spent a fair amount of my career trying to get people access into healthcare and get it out of sort of the big institutional model. And I think that trend is happening today as well with the amount of telehealth that's out there and so forth. But sort of this remote testing model goes very well along with that, where people can test anytime they can, because let's face it, the attention span of the mobile generation
Mm.
is small. So we need to work with that and capture it when we can, and hopefully we can keep up with those attention spans.
Amazing. I have a couple of questions I ask all of my guests. What is the book that changed your life?
Book that changed my life. I would say probably you won't recognize it. But there's a book by a Nobel laureate, Arno Penzias, called Ideas and Information. And, it talks about sort of the opening up of thought and ideas with information. And, part of that is what sort of inspired what we're talking about today. But I've been working in and around that in the healthcare space and for a long time, and I think that book for me really said, well, wait a minute. Yeah, I mean, everybody needs to be empowered this way. And the connectivity that we have in the world today really is changing that in a way that, we haven't had a conversation about, and we haven't had the ability to do in, hundreds of years. I mean, it's sort of a new paradigm, and I think we're still adjusting to that, right? I mean, you can look at information about elections, you can look at information about STIs, you can look at information about health and politics and everything else. And to me, it's just sort of, it was very prescient of sort of the times that we're now in. The book itself is probably almost 20 years old, I would guess, at this point. It was very prescient about how information, is changing the world, and access to information. So
That's what's
that's
interesting,
my
isn't it,
pick.
about interest about information? Because I mean, for me, even though I was brought up in a very Catholic school, this information about sexuality I accessed in women's magazines in the 90s. That's where I got my sex education from because I was curious. But imagine having the internet now. If you have that curiosity, I mean, you can Google anything, and but obviously you have to kind of have some discernment and know which
And
a
you
good
can get
source
you
is.
can get a wrong answer, or you can get a right answer, and
Yeah,
you may not know the difference. And that's the big challenge, right?
yeah.
I mean, we have that challenge across the board in almost every topic area. But you can get some great information off the internet. I mean,
Mm.
in my life,
Well,
I've learned a lot.
once you can
But you have
identify a good source, then that's trustworthy and
exactly.
you've got some scientific backup and what have you. But you can get access to anything, and I'm always surprised about because sexuality is my topic, about the lack of curiosity about this thing that drives the world. I mean, I've always that's always been something I don't quite understand. Because for me, when I was growing up, I could see that my education was incomplete.
Yeah.
About there's nothing conscious about contraception, about safe sex, and then
Well, and it's interesting, particularly around sexuality, right? The major studies that most of our information up until the 90s was based off of you know two people's work, really, who were shunned at the time,
mm,
and I'm talking about the scientific side of things. And it turns out they were doing actually very in-depth scientific work in a realm that nobody had wanted to touch and talk about. And yet today there's still this gap of understanding, but that's starting to change now as well. And I think people are starting to go back and bring some science to some of those discussions. But obviously there's a lot more than just science to sexual wellness. And it's neat to me to see those discussions starting to happen where those two worlds can sort of collide again, in a way that's not been possible before. So we have a lot more to learn, I guess, is the short version of that.
Definitely. Another question I ask everyone is, what's the quote that you live by, or the phrase or affirmation? Do you have a phrase that is your philosophy? Or
well, I mean, the simple, if at first you don't succeed, I mean, I'm a scientist at my core, so and I live in Silicon Valley, so failure comes easy. It's getting past the failure that's actually hard, and not giving up when you have a first failure. So there's the Silicon Valley adage of fail fast and fail often, because those are learning points. And I try and imbue that in my kids too. When they're in school and they're learning something, they make a mistake. It's not a tragedy. It's a celebration. It's, oh, you recognize that this was wrong, and now you can sit down and figure out what the right path was, or what the right answer was, or a better answer. It doesn't even have to be right or wrong. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important to me personally, that there's always a way.
There's always a way. That's a good message. So where can people find you?
Well, our kits are available on our website or in Amazon. So www.basisdx.org. And if you can spell my name, I'm not hard to Google. I'm out there. And yeah, we're physically we're in the middle of Silicon Valley here in Redwood City, and we thankfully have had engagement from all over the country with this, and it's really exciting to see it take place. But we welcome any and all queries around it, and hope that people can find their path towards sexual health, wellness, and happiness.
Good. That's a good message. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
The book I'm reading now is Red Sky at Sunrise by Laurie Lee. And this is a trilogy with Cider with Rosie. And the second story, which I'm going to talk about in more detail here, is called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. And then the final story is A Moment of War. Someone gave me this book when I was living in Madrid many moons ago, and I must confess that at the time, I was not an avid reader like I am today. But oh my God, I absolutely devoured As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. I still have this book on my shelf many, many years later. This is the reason why I don't actually lend my own books out, because sometimes they never come back, and I do have some books on my shelf that have been loaned to me, and it ended up, staying with me, which I'm grateful for. But at the same time, yeah, it's not good to have books that disappear. I'm a real lover of the physical book, not a Kindle lover, but the real physical book that I can touch and turn the pages and not have to have my eyes on a screen. I do see the value of ebooks. They can be so much easier if you're traveling, but I don't think the experience is the same. I'm just loving books. Also, I used to work in printing, so I appreciate the process of printing and just how tangible it is, really. But going back to the story, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, it's part of a trilogy. It's a memoir. And it follows Laurie Lee, the author, who is from a small village in England, and he goes to London. This is the 1930s, and it's quite random. But he meets someone who's going to Spain, and he thinks, oh, well, I'll go to Spain too. And you see a map of Spain, and basically he lands in Galicia. I'm just speaking from memory now. I did read this a very long time ago. But he actually walks the whole of Spain from Galicia down to Andalusia. And I just find, you really appreciate distance when you walk. I've never learned to drive. So walking for me is quite fascinating. And I also did something called the Camino de Santiago a few years ago, which is a pilgrimage walk. There are many routes you can take. I did part of the French one. I did the last 110 kilometers, getting up every day and just walking to Santiago. And it's a kind of spiritual, very mindful experience. And you're very much in the moment. And you meet so many people who are also walking. And everyone has a different approach to it. But I'm just a walker in general. I don't actually use public transport. I'm walking everywhere. Walking is my form of transport. So actually read a memoir that's based on walking and discovery is just amazing for me. And also looking at Spain in the 1930s, which is, less than 100 years ago. But the way he talks about Spain, like, for example, he was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed English guy who didn't speak the language. And every time, and all he had was a violin to kind of play and be a busker almost. But anyway, every time he arrived in a new village, he would encounter this incredible hospitality that's quite typical of Spain, of Spanish culture in general. But back then, imagine how exotic he would have been. This is long before hooligan tourists are invading Spain like we have now. Right now we have this big almost campaign about tourists not being welcome. On every, almost every wall you can see graffiti with "tourists go home" on it. So it's not exactly a welcoming experience right now. But in the 1930s, it was like, oh, who are you? Here is some soup. Here's a bed for the night. So the hospitality was just absolutely incredible. And the stories, the anecdotes of the encounters that he had, with very simple people, poor people, but incredibly generous, which is a fantastic, when you read stories about that, about how generosity has nothing to do with how much money you have. Sometimes the less people have, the more generous they are, which is a kind of seems like contradictory. But there is a point in the book when he gets to Andalusia, and I think his violin breaks, which is obviously his source of income. So that's quite serious. And then someone says, "Oh, I've got a spare one at home. I can give it to you." And I think I've experienced as well the incredible hospitality of Spanish people. Not the ones who want the tourists to go home, but things are still there's still a great sense of hospitality in Spanish culture. I know when I've made good friends, when I go to their village, they don't let you pay there. They just give you everything they have, and they're just incredibly, incredibly generous and curious about your love for Spain. Because I think life in Spain is so nice. It's hard, but there are values that are kind of attractive. It's an attractive way of living. For example, valuing family, valuing time off, and having lots of Catholic feast days is kind of cool, because I'm not sure how many there are a year, but let's say there could be about 15 saints days plus local fiestas. And if a day falls on a Tuesday, you get the Monday off. They call it the bridge. And also if it's a Thursday, you get the Friday off. So there is real emphasis and importance given to your time off and to nature. And just last weekend, I went to this incredible beach, which was 20 minutes away from Barcelona. And the kind of life I'm living is it is like luxurious every day. I was talking to a friend yesterday about London, and the title of this podcast, The Orgasmic Lifestyle. I don't think you really can live an orgasmic lifestyle in London, even with all the money in the world, because you're still not getting the sea, the sun, the incredible weather, access to amazing fruit and vegetables that's locally sourced, organic at a decent price, and really having that prioritization of your free time, which is so, so, so important. And another friend of mine who is from New York was saying that when she was in New York, it was always the first question people ask you in any social context is, what do you do? Whereas here it's, who are you? It's where you're from, or, it's, I've been in many, many social contexts where for months and months where people have no idea what I do. Then when they find out that I review sex toys for a living, then they're like, oh, really? I had no idea. And that just goes to show that we can be engaged in conversations that don't revolve around what you're doing. Because if you think about it, why are you talking about your job on your time off? There has to be so much more to a person and to a life than working. So this is how this is a current reflection on Spanish culture right now. But it's so interesting to see, what it was like in the 1930s for an English person who didn't speak the language, just literally walking from the north to the south. I'm not sure how big Spain is, but it's pretty a big place. And sometimes I would love to actually take part in more kind of walking adventures and stop off at a different place every night, like I did in the Camino, but do some kind of maybe more trails that I'm not quite, not off the beaten track maybe. But I really do believe that when you walk, you do appreciate distance so much more, and you're more present in the journey as well. So yes, that's if anyone who is interested in walking, in history, in Spanish culture, I would highly recommend this, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning by Laurie Lee, and that's part of the trilogy called Red Sky at Sunrise. Now it's time to slow things down as we prepare for this episode's guided affirmations meditation. It's probably not a good idea to listen to this while driving or operating machinery. Instead, take a break from whatever you're doing, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and enjoy. Safe sex is self-care. Safe sex is smart and sexy. Healthy choices lead to fulfilling intimacy. I respect my boundaries and practice safe sex. I deserve pleasure and peace of mind, which is why I practice safe sex. My health, safety, and pleasure are always in harmony when I choose protection. I deserve safety, respect, and pleasure. Safe sex is self-care. Safe sex is smart and sexy. Protection is a natural part of my pleasure. Safe sex is an expression of self-love. I communicate openly and confidently about my needs and boundaries. My body is a temple, and I treat it with respect and love. I deserve safety, respect, and pleasure. Safe sex is self-care. Safe sex is smart and sexy. I prioritize my health in every encounter. Consent and protection equal great sex. I trust myself to set and maintain safe boundaries in all my intimate encounters. Using protection is a natural part of my sexual routine. I deserve safety, respect, and pleasure. Safe sex is self-care. Safe sex is smart and sexy. I always prioritize my health and safety. Safe sex is empowering and responsible. I confidently communicate my boundaries and practice safe sex with every partner. Protecting myself and my partner is an act of love and respect. I deserve safety, respect, and pleasure. Safe sex is self-care. Safe sex is smart and sexy. Consent, communication, and protection are key to fulfilling and safe sexual experiences. I value my sexual health and make informed decisions every time. I protect my body and my pleasure. I choose protection and peace of mind. I deserve safety, respect, and pleasure. Are you looking to strengthen your pelvic floor in a fun and engaging way? Introducing PeriFit, the pelvic floor trainer that combines biofeedback with interactive video games. With PeriFit, you can track your progress and improve your pelvic health while playing games with your vagina on your smartphone. It's easy, effective, and more importantly, it's fun. For a limited time, you can get 25% off with the code Venus15 at checkout. Visit perifit.co today and take control of your pelvic health with PeriFit. That's perifit.co and use the code Venus15 for 25% off. The link is also in the show notes below. Strengthen, play, and thrive with PeriFit. Disclaimer: consult your healthcare provider before starting any new fitness program. To find out more about me and my orgasmic lifestyle, visit venusohara.org or follow me on Instagram at instagram.com/venusohara. Make sure to search for the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast by Venus O'Hara in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening, have an orgasmic week, and make sure every day is a climax.